The first two parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are heavily defined by the curse of the Joestar family, where it's stated that the men are pretty much all fated to die within the first 40 years of their lives. Jonathan and his son, George Joestar, both died at the hands of Dio, in the case of Jonathan directly fighting Dio, and with George indirectly with, the zombie that made it into the army and whatever and whatnot. But the first Joestar to not only defy this curse, but outright reject it was my favorite Joestar, Joseph Joestar, who lived to the events of Part 6 and likely survived into the new universe that's set by Araki. And over the course of the different parts, we have seen him grow as a character, which is once again reflected in Araki's writing decisions throughout those parts. So in today's video, I want to look at the evolution of Joseph Joestar as a character and how this would go on to influence Araki's writing with other Joestars in the subsequent parts thereafter. So with all the preamble out the way, I want to say thank you guys so much for the support that you've been showing as usual. Please continue liking, commenting, subscribing. Now, let's get it done. So to truly understand the evolution that takes place with Joseph over the course of the story and the different parts in which he appears, I think it's important to take a short look at his grandfather, Jonathan Joestar, because from the very beginning, he is described as a gentleman through and through. He is the pure embodiment of good within the story. The only flaw in his character is literally just how good of a person he is. He is always willing to see the best in others, which does eventually lead Dio to be able to steal his body and do the things that he does later on down the line to the, the Joestar bloodline. But he fights like a gentleman. He's chivalrous. He doesn't do any tricks, because what you see with Jonathan is exactly what it is. If Jonathan is throwing a punch at you, he's just throwing a punch at you. There's nothing else. There's no fake out behind that, right? Joseph, on the other hand, feels like an overcorrection on Araki's part. He is willing to lie and cheat to win if necessary. Sure, he still does have the same good heart as Jonathan in the sense that he is always willing to do what is right when it's time, because while this is shown time and time again in part 2 with the Pillarman, I believe the beginning with Straight So when he shows up in New York is the best example that I've seen for myself, personally speaking, right? Joseph's willingness to be cunning and deceptive is portrayed pretty much off the bat. We see him and Smokey in the restaurant eating while Straight So stalks them, and at first, Joseph plays dumb by making it seem as though he hasn't already assessed the situation before he even attempts to start the fight, right? Then once he has given his opponent a false sense of security, he does what is one of my favorite scenes in all of JoJo's and maybe even anime, and I'm sure we all know what it is, and he pulls out a Tommy gun and lights him up in the middle of New York. And I love it so much because this once again reaffirms that Joseph is in no mood to run the fair ones with you. If he can take you out right there, he is willing to end the fight as quickly as possible by any means possible, right? And when they fight again on what I'm assuming is the Brooklyn Bridge, I did a little bit of research. Some people said the Manhattan Bridge, some said the Brooklyn Bridge. There's no concrete, it's never named, right? But we see his cunningness. Straight So uses the laser beams that, he gets from being a vampire, only to have them reflected right back at him using hormone-infused shot glasses on Joseph's part, which eventually does lead to his defeat. But this is the thing though, that's such a creative way of thinking of applying hormone, in which it is exactly why Araki deviated away from hormone, because with Joseph, he pretty much did all that he could with hormone. Jonathan was not using hormone the same way that Joseph was, right? Joseph's first real fight gets the audience ready for a completely different character than what we have seen in Jonathan, and shows that while he has a good heart, much like his grandfather, he isn't above throwing dirt in your eyes if he has to. And the next time we see Joseph is in part 3, the Stardust Crusaders, because by this point he is 67 years old, and the way he approaches fights and life has completely changed from how he did in the previous part, right? He's less reckless and as hot-blooded as he used to be. He now understands that he serves better as a mentor to our new JoJo in Jotaro, right? He serves as the tactical thinker of the group. He sets up plans and basically enables the group to travel. He's the benefactor, to put it simply, right? He plans, he funds, and all that kind of stuff. And Hermit Purple is a great reflection of this, because while Joseph mainly uses the clairvoyance ability of the stand, it also has some offensive and evasive capabilities, which are utilized mostly in his fight against Dio at the end of part 3, which is where I believe he truly shines the most in part 3, right? Because the goal during this fight for Joseph wasn't to outright defeat Dio, but to assess the ability of his stands for the rest of the Stardust Crusaders, mainly Jotaro, to take him on. He isn't the playmaker of the group anymore like he used to be. His hubris is still there, but it's used in a way to confuse the opponents. Joseph isn't dependent on his luck the way he used to be in part 2, because while he is, again, very much tied for my favorite JoJo with his son Josuke, I also do love Josuke. I know I said he's my favorite JoJo before, but I really love Josuke, man. He has my favorite stand in the entire, of all the Joestars, if I'm being honest. I can admit that Joseph beating the Pillarmen, especially Cars, was very much due to luck and plot armor, and his conniving, cunning attitude, but there was a lot of luck in there. That's just kind of Joseph's thing, right? Which leads me to Joseph's final appearance in the story, which is again in part 4, Diamond is Unbreakable. Because Joseph in part 4, there isn't exactly much to say about him, because he isn't physically active anymore, because he's like in his 80s or late 70s by this point, and he's suffering from dementia and he's senile. But the biggest development for his character, however, is finding out that he had an affair, which is huge for his character, because Araki is showing that he's willing to introduce moral complexities in his characters beyond Jotaro's, edgy disrespect for women at a young age that he had in part 3. That, I believe, was Araki finally starting to like deviate away from, okay, the JoJos, they're kind of morally ambiguous, but they're really just good people. And again, they are good people, but they do make mistakes, just like how anyone in the real world does, right? And I love that, because while we don't see exactly how this unfolds between the relationship between him and Suzy Q, we are informed that she isn't happy, and it makes sense. Your husband of what, 60 years by this point, had an affair and cheated on you and had a kid. So I don't blame Suzy Q for not being happy, but I think this is largely important because it sets a precedent that our heroes in this universe, again, aren't infallible. The Jonathan we know, going back to Jonathan, would never have done something like this to Arena. Joseph's journey over the course of the first universe truly is, in my opinion, on par with that of Dio and Jotaro, because while I still think Dio and Jotaro had a better developmental journey, but that only stems from the fact that in Jotaro's case, he came along when he really started getting developed, when Araki was willing to throw in, again, those moral complexities into his character, and Dio just was always ever present over the course of parts 1 through 6 in some way, shape, or form, right? But Joseph, again, was the blueprint, which leads us to seeing how this translated with other Joestars. So for this section of the video, I mainly want to focus on Jotaro. I won't really be talking about Josuke or Giorno, but I will touch on Jolene just a little bit towards the end of the video to see how the universe developmentally is with Joestars by the end of the story, at least this section of the story. And Jotaro starts the story off as a very stoic and brash personality. He is disrespectful towards both his mother and the girls who fawn over him at the beginning of the story. He uses crass language when referring to them, and while we would now come to know that he is something of a tsundere, which is by definition, he acts harsh, but secretly he truly loves those around him, right? And in part 3, while yes, he is very much analytically minded at times, he primarily relies on brute force to stop any stand user that they may come across. And looking at the stands that we see in part 3, it makes sense. Araki, by this point in the story, hadn't exactly started experimenting with what we would call hacks abilities as of yet. At least not to the degree that he does later on in the story. And I mean, when Dio shows up with the world, yes, that is a hacks ability. Time Stop is definitely very much a hacks ability, but him punching his way through any and all problems he encounters makes sense. And also, Star Platinum has Time Stop, so is it really a hacks ability if you both kind of have the same thing? Not really. And also, Dio's a vampire. He could have used his vampire abilities, but he didn't. Not really. Not really. But moving on to part 4, we have Jotaro, who is at this point 10 years older. So it's 10 years later. showing up in Morio as a mentor figure to Josuke, taking on the role Joseph once did for him on his own journey. And here we see a more analytical Jotaro than what we saw in part 3. He isn't just trying to punch his way through everything he comes across anymore. And I mean, he kind of has to. Even though he has time stop, it is only for half a second by this point, because for some reason, the 5-second time stop that he developed in part 3 is just kind of gone. And pretty much all the stands in part 4 have secondary hacks abilities that are just straight up busted. Like, let's call a spade a spade. The stands in part 4 would wipe the floor with the stands in part 3. The only stands in part 3 that could stand to part 4 stand is like, again, the world and Star Platinum the world. Like, there's probably some more in there. I'm not really thinking about them right now, but the stands in part 4 very much are superior to the stands that appear in part 3. And he just can't walk up to them the way he used to and again punch them, because while Star Platinum is still the most physically powerful stand in the series, it means nothing if you can't find, get close to, or even hit your opponent, because some stands you just straight up can't hit, like that one, the lightning stand, the electricity stand. You couldn't hit it, you couldn't find it. You find it sometimes, and you couldn't get close to it they couldn't get close to it for a very long time. So you can't just walk up to it and punch it. And also, one of the reasons why Josuke was so good at handling stands in part 4 was because of how he used his healing ability. It didn't only work on people, it worked on objects. So he would use that as a setup. And, you know, I love Jotaro and the way he uses the stand. I love Crazy Diamond. Crazy Diamond is a phenomenal stand. But moving on to part 6, which is the last time we see Jotaro, we learned that he is something of an absent father in Jolene's life. And again, this is Araki throwing in that moral ambiguity with his character, because while he does have a good reason, as it is to protect Jolene from the, stuff that usually targets the Joestar bloodline, his unwillingness to be involved in her life led her down the path we see in part 6, which is arguably more dangerous, because if he just stuck with her, maybe gave her a stand and trained her a little bit, maybe she wouldn't have ended up in that situation in the first place, right? But this is leading into me touching on Jolene just a little bit, because she is the first example of a Joestar in the mainline family who outright lives to cause trouble, and she's quite naive, if we're being honest. I know all the Joestars at the beginning of the story are naive, but Jolene is kind of the most naive, right? She's a more realistic version of Jotaro and Joseph, in my own opinion. So to say that the naivety is not a knock on her character, it just makes her more realistic. Her rebelling is done for attention, making her the first Joestar to, again, inadvertently create her own problems. Because in part 6, if Jolene wasn't involved with her boyfriend and that crash wasn't faked, Pucci wouldn't have been able to get her in prison, which means that Jotaro wouldn't have come to the prison and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying it's Jolene's fault. It is indirectly Jotaro's fault for being an absent father in his daughter's life. People love to blame Jolene for Jotaro either dying or losing his memories or his stand disc. Jotaro has just as much of a part to play in it as the same as Jolene, because Jolene wouldn't have been led to those things if Jotaro was a present father in her life, right? But part 6 also sees the best development of a JoJo in a single part, at least up until this point, in my opinion. Jolene goes from being a naive, rebellious girl to a strategic, charismatic leader. Araki takes the best and worst qualities from all the JoJos that he's done by this point, and it leads him to create what I think is one of the best character arcs in JoJo's up until this point, because again, part 7 is phenomenal, right? And him knowing that this character likely wouldn't appear again was probably the best thing that could have happened for her, because it meant that he really put all that work in that he would have done over the course of different parts into one compressed part for Jolene, right? And Joseph Joestar was the beginning of Araki's willingness to start fresh and change up the stories in ways readers could never imagine. He is the blueprint for future Joestars in terms of having them display their flaws and finding ways to have them grow from it during the story or over the course of the story. And I know in my previous video about Dio, I did call him the best character in the original universe, or the original JoJo's universe. I don't know what they call that kind of stuff. And I still stand by this sentiment, but Joseph is definitely a close second, and he's not behind him by far at all. And Jotaro, he's up there. Jolene, up there. Giorno's cool. Josuke's, I love Josuke. But that's the video. You know, I hope you guys enjoyed it as usual, and leave a comment down below and tell me what you think. You know, let me know how you think Araki's willingness to stick with Joseph over the course of the part has impacted his character writing in terms of the JoJos. And as usual, please leave a like, you know, and subscribe if you've made it this far into the video, because if you have, it means you enjoyed the video. I'm just saying, you know, I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.